Here and pleasure. All right.
Hey everyone, my name is Naiditch. I teach history at the Yeshiva. And today we're going to do a little bit of history about, in particular, the Jews and the rise of Islam. We're going to go through, in particular, a lot of history of Islam. We're going to talk about how it's similar to Judaism, how Judaism is affected by it, how it was affected by Judaism. We're going to talk a little bit about the early history. We're going to talk about Jews under Islam, and then hopefully we'll be able to reach by the end just a little bit of just sort of quick shot through most of the Middle Ages to the modern ages, and then by the end a little bit of discussion on how modern Islam is affected by the past. So let's just get right into it. So I want to talk for a minute about the 6th century, the century right before Islam rises. This is the 6th century. This is the map of the world in the 6th century. Let's see if I can actually do this with my little. You guys see this? So this is the Sassanid dynasty and the Persian Empire. This is where the Gemara is made, right here along this little, along these two rivers. This is where we get the Amoraim. Over here in the Byzantine Empire, that's where we get the Tanaim. The Byzantine Empire, of course, is the remnants of Rome. I'll alternately call it Eastern Rome, the Byzantine Empire, or Rome. All three are the same thing. At this point in time, Rome has divided into two, and the Sasanian Empire is shrinking and shrinking. Beginning of the 7th century, Persians and Eastern Romans are constantly at war with each other and with outside forces. The Persians and Romans are now dealing with groups of. I'm going to turn my phone off, which I should have done beforehand. The Persians and the Romans are both dealing with each other constantly at war with one another, and they're also constantly at war with people outside, mostly nomadic Turkish tribes from Central Asia, which even at this point are becoming a problem. You may have heard of the Huns. The Huns are a problem. Prior to that, after that, will come the Tartars and of course most famously the Mongols. They're all these tribes that sort of come out of Asia and bother the Europeans and bother the Iranians, and they're doing so now in addition to the fact. So now you have already at this time the Persians and the Eastern Romans at war with each other as well as with outside forces. Both of these states, in response to this, have become very religiously repressive. The Romans, under Justinian, have enacted numerous anti-Jewish laws. Jews are no longer allowed to celebrate Pesach when Jews celebrate Pesach. Now they have to celebrate it when the Christians celebrate Pesach, because that's the way it is. They're not allowed to learn the Mishnah, right? The Mishnah is this weird other book that the Jews have. They have to just learn the Torah, and even the Torah they can't learn in Hebrew. They have to learn it in a good language like Greek or Arabic. The Sassanid Persians, for their part, are responding to instability with stronger and stronger promotions of their own state religion, which is Zoroastrianism. You may have heard of Zoroastrianism in the Gemara. They're called the Amgusha, the Magi, and also they're called the Fvarim or Chaverim. The Torah will talk about them. The Gemara in particular will talk about them on occasion. And this time they're becoming very, very repressive. Both of these states, by the way, are using Arab mercenaries as border proxies. So Arabs are involved at this time. They're northern Arabs on both sides, the Lathanids and the Ghassanids. They are basically the sort of they have their own little kingdoms, and the Byzantines and the Persians are using them to fight each other. Beneath them is Arabia. It is a vast desert. It has a bunch of nomadic tribes, and they are constantly at war or trade. And for them, it is the same thing. If you can kill your neighbors and take their stuff, that's great. If not, you can trade with them. That's the basic rule, not just of the Arabs, but of every culture that's around that basically exists in a sort of pre-civilizational time. Interestingly, 100 years prior to this, there was in fact a Jewish kingdom in Arabia called the Himyarite Kingdom, and it was down here in Yemen, and it was under control very briefly of a Jewish rulership. We don't know what kind of Jews they are. The Gemara does not talk about them very much. It seems like they were some sort of offshoot of Tzedukim or something like that. We just don't have a lot of information except brief little hints here and there. Around this time, what's going on for the Jews? It is not great. Jews are suffering greatly under both of the countries. Remember, the Gemara tells us that the reason that we were brought to Persia was so that we could have relief from Rome. Now, we don't have any relief in Rome, and we don't have any relief in Persia. Things are going pretty terribly for the Jews. It's at or around this time, slightly earlier, that the Talmud has been officially closed by the last Amoraim, that's Ravina and Rav Ashi. And now we have this quiet group of rabbis called the Savoraim, from the word svara, which means reasoning. And they are basically doing their job of quietly smoothing out and adding bits and pieces to the Gemara in order to make it more readable and more understandable. You may or may not have heard about these people. How many people have heard of the Savoraim? Okay, enough. Okay. The reason you don't hear about them is because this isn't a time where history is being written. This isn't a peaceful time. This is a largely chaotic and brutal time. So what do the Savoraim do? They amend and add text for clarity. They add explanations for reasonings of their own teachers. They insert headings and quotations from the Mishnah to show exactly where the Gemara begins discussing that part of the Mishnah, et cetera, et cetera. They basically sort of edit the Talmud together. They do this, by the way, despite the massive chaos around them. We're talking about a time when both Surah and Pumbedisa have been burnt down and replaced by the Reish Galusa has been murdered. He is actually crucified on a bridge for trying to revolt. One of his children manages to run away to Israel, doesn't have a much better time in Israel, ends up fleeing up to Tveria, and in the mountains has a small yeshiva. Yeah. Yes. Oh, yes. At this time, it was chaotic. He basically held together his own kingdom for about 5 years. Remember, there was no rulership in Mesopotamia. Not the first kingdom in Mesopotamia. Josephus talks about an earlier one, but this is for a little bit of time, Mar Zutra is able to actually hold together a small kingdom. Just because there's so much chaos and there's no order, he's able to sort of gather and create his own kingdom. What's that? What was what? Pumbedisa area, beneath what is now current-day Baghdad. The Rambam in his Mishnah Torah says it, I think, better than I can. He says, after Rav Ashi compiled the Gemara, the Jews became scattered throughout the world, becoming exceedingly dispersed to the most remote continents. Conflict filled the world, and they no longer attended the yeshivas by the thousands or tens of thousands. Now there is only the isolated remnants, those who Hashem calls in every city and country. Interestingly enough, Rambam did not say this in English. What did he say it in? Arabic, right? Most likely Judeo-Arabic. Although I think the Mishnah Torah was originally written in Hebrew, I'm not positive. The Mishnah Torah was written in Hebrew, or was it originally written in Arabic? Does anyone know? Hebrew. It was written in Hebrew. So the Mishnah Torah was written in Hebrew, Guide to the Perplexed in Arabic. In Hebrew. Everything else he would have written in Arabic. How does the Rambam come to speak Arabic? We'll get to that in a little bit. Well, actually in a couple hours. What's that? Yes, right. There's a document that they discovered in the Cairo Geniza, in the Rambam's own handwriting. He's taking words, and he has the Hebrew word, he has the Arabic translation, and he has a early Hispanic translation as well. So the Rambam obviously would have spoken quite a few different languages. Hold on, I have something on the chat here. Thank you. Yes, Pumbedisa and Surah were the famous last yeshivas of the Amoraim. Now we talk about Muhammad and the rise of Muhammad. First, let's talk about what's going on in Arabia at this time. Pre-Islamic Arabia is filled with people of varying religious beliefs, accepted and heretical Christian groups, Jews, accepted and heretical Jewish groups, and Arabic polytheism with an Abrahamic God at the top. Interestingly enough, they did believe that they were from Ishmael. They did have space in their culture to worship God or Allah. Allah, of course, coming from the Jewish word, from the Hebrew word for Hashem, Kael, right? In Mesopotamian, it would have been Ilu. In Arabic, it's Allah. In Hebrew, it's Kael.
Stop. It's not loud.
And I think he agrees with me.
It's not loud.
I'm gonna go ahead and mute. I don't know. I don't know how to do it. We will get to that. No. Please, your participation is absolutely, let's go. Interestingly enough, the Arabs are even early on very obsessed with cubes. This is one of their gods. They really, I guess, when you live in just a culture of rolling hills and not a lot else, you become very into the idea of something cubical. I don't know what it is. Whatever it is, the idea of a cube is very appealing to them, and many of their gods are portrayed even before the Kaaba, the most famous of cubes. Many of their gods are portrayed in this cubic form. What's that? I don't know. They did bring the zero into culture, but that was a little later, and they borrowed it from the Indians. So they were square. They were real squares. So this is an early Arabic god. There were, in fact, Jews in Arabia. Now, would we call them rabbinic Jews? Not sure. Arabia was home to Jews for at least 500 years before Muhammad's birth. They were respected there as craftsmen, metalworkers, jewelers, date palm farmers. The most famous Arabic poet of the region, by the way, the king of Tema, was Shmuel bin Adiyah, a Jew who wrote battle hymns in Arabic. And as a matter of fact, many of the Jews were a part of this sort of early pre-Islamic poetic tradition that would come into Islam and then be borrowed by the Jews in the 1100s as piyutim. The Jews there lived in about 20 tribal groups clustered in the main cities, if you can call them cities, of Tema, Medina, which at the time was called Yathrib, and Khaybar. In fact, two Arab tribal groups were actually vassals of Jewish groups. So Arab tribal groups would be vassals of these more prominent and popular Jewish groups. In short, vassals means sort of like they would owe their allegiance to. They would be vassals, second tier, right. So not quite a duke of its own tribal state, but it would owe its allegiance to it. It would have to be called up to go to war for these tribes. While there were some Christian Arabs, and they did in fact have a tremendous influence on Muhammad, really he was surrounded by a lot of Jews. A lot of Jews, a lot of polytheists, and a couple of Christians. These were large communities, but these were tribal communities. We don't know, again, were they rabbinic Jews? We're not sure. They were probably likely scattered out into the forest, into the desert after the destruction of the temple. You would have probably had weird Essene groups, Saduki groups, whatever sort of Yiddish. Again, you could actually be a Gemara following Jew in the year 200, and in the year 600, completely different, right? You could eat chicken and milk and not have a problem with it. You could do a ton of other things. So imagine your Gemara comes from the year 200, and now 600 years later, you don't have the benefit of Pumbedisa, but your Zaidi and his Zaidi and his Zaidi ate chicken with milk, and so what are you going to do? So probably a lot of strange tribes like this, right? Mecca itself is a tiny little trading community here on the trading scene here, right here on this map. Now, as I said, the Sasanian Empire and the Anatolian Empire are now in pretty much constant war. So any trading route that goes up this way, which was pretty common, ones from India that would bring spices and other kinds of riches, are now pretty much blocked off. What are you going to do? Well, if you're an intelligent and most likely Jewish merchant, you're going to go from India up through the Hejaz, past Yemen, and find a slightly safer route. That's going to take you past Mecca. And so Mecca at this time is experiencing a huge boom because no one wants to go the dangerous route. They're all sort of avoiding the war areas. And now Mecca is becoming richer and richer and richer. It also has religious significance for the Muslims at this time. Is it the place where Allah is? No, it's basically a place where everyone sort of brings their gods. They all come, they all bring their gods, they all put them in this big place, cube. And obviously Kaaba is a corruption of the word cube. They all bring them there and they all basically say, this is our sacred space. None of us is going to get in any trouble. None of us is going to get in any fights here. We're all just going to get along here in this space of sacredity for all of our pantheon of gods. So basically, this is their Mount Vesuvius. This is where all their gods hang out. And so this is the place where obviously they can't actually fight or battle each other. And so it becomes, as much as it starts to become wealthy as a trading depot, it's also starting to become much more popular as a place for various polytheistic religions to come together. In this rises Muhammad. Notice he's there pictured without a face. The Muslims, like the Jews, very antagonistic toward the idea of depicting ancient holy people with faces. I don't know if that was a switch over from Islam to Judaism or from Judaism to Islam, but they certainly get a lot more upset when you depict someone with the face, as we found out in the Charlie Hebdo massacre. So I am obviously not going to show, out of deep respect for the Islamic religion, I'm not going to show any pictures of Muslims of Muhammad's face. I'm simply going to show you this image of him very faceless. Born in 570 in Mecca, he is an orphan from a lesser family of a big noble tribe, the Quraysh. Now, orphan from a lesser family, or in general, any kind of situation like that, you know they're going to become great. It's all through the Torah. Anyone from a lesser family who's an orphan, Dovner Melech, any of these things, the third son, the last son, someone with comparatively little power, they're sort of destined for it, and so is Muhammad. He becomes a caravan driver and actually marries his wealthy widowed boss. His boss is about 20 years older than him, but she makes a smart move and he makes a smart move. He's pretty respected. He's a pretty solid person in his time and place, at least so the history comes down to us. And she decides, I'm going to marry this guy, and basically we're going to have an alliance that's more than just him being my business manager. As a merchant, he is immersed in the cultures around him. He is going up and down along the Hijaz. He is talking to Christians, he is talking to Jews, and he is just getting a whole mishmash of different ideas about religion from all of these people. At a certain point, he becomes depressed. He starts wandering around the hills of Mecca, sitting in caves and thinking about God. This is not an unusual practice at the time. Many mystics will do this. In fact, monasticism as a concept becomes very popular at this time. Christians are doing it all over the place. They're wandering off into the desert, climbing up on top of pillars like skylights, and just sitting around and thinking about God for hours and hours at a time. Muhammad's going to take a little bit of this on and give this a try. In one of these times, he claims to experience a revelation. Who comes to him? The angel Jibril, or as we know him in Hebrew, Gabriel. He comes and he declares to Muhammad that he is the prophet of God. He preaches this message and is persecuted by his own tribe in Mecca. So he preaches, he goes down, he starts telling people I'm the prophet of God, and his own people in Mecca are like, that's great, get out of here. So what happens? He gets a couple of followers. But again, anytime anyone's going to say I'm God, or I'm the prophet of God, you got to listen to me. He's not going to get a lot of great responses. So in 622, he's actually kicked out of Mecca and forced to go up to Yathrib, which will become what we today call Medina. Yathrib, Khaybar, Wadi al-Qura, these are heavily Jewish cities with large Jewish populations. A couple of years back, there was a famous people chanting Khaybar, Khaybar al-Yahud. This was a reference to Khaybar, where Muhammad was basically going to come one day and kick all the Jews out. Why does Muhammad end up having a bad relationship with Jews? We're about to find that out now. Not at full power, Muhammad shows up at Yathrib. He's actually been invited there by the polytheists, not the Jews, to sort of set up shop as a prophet and as a mediator between people. At that time, he creates the concept of the people of the book. Thank God, because this is what the Jews are going to basically be able to hide under when Islam comes to full power. He creates basically a constitution that provides rights for Christians and Jews, anyone who's a monotheist, who believes in one God, to give them the space to live without being assaulted. He's going to do this at that time, and now he's going to start really preaching in full his idea and all the stuff he's getting from his angel. Muhammad also adopts while he's there many of the principles and practices of Judaism. Right? Obviously, there's one God, and he's a God of justice and mercy. It's a big key for Muhammad. Big key for Yiddishkeit. Prayer at this time is facing toward Yerushalayim. Fasting on the 10th day of the new year basically pulls Yom Kippur right out of right there. Dietary laws, you all know halal. If you go over to Costco now, you can get a whole lamb. I'm super jealous. And charity and modesty and a lot of other concepts, he's just pulling straight from Yiddishkeit. Muhammad was sure that the Jews would follow him. Same, by the way, goes for later Protestants. If anyone knows Luther also was pretty convinced that Jews would follow him. and then got very upset when the Jews didn't follow him. Guess what's going to happen here? Because the Jews are not going to follow him. He comes up, he shows up, he says, hey, you know that story of yours in the Torah where Abraham sacrifices Yitzchak and then Yitzchak is saved? Obviously, you guys got it wrong. It's Yishmael. And then you say, nah, it was Yitzchak. But yes, they did have a concept amongst themselves that they were from the tribe of Yishmael. And they all, and he would go on to use that. The pagans, however, of Medina, including the tribes that owe their allegiance to the Jews, will accept Muhammad, but the Jews will not. They will not accept a new non-Jewish prophet, right? At this point, unsurprisingly, he begins to sour on the Jews. He exiles the Banu Nadir and the Banu Chainuka, that's two of the tribes that are there, and accusing them of trying to poison him. Now, according to the rumor mill at the time, one of the women of the Banu Nadir actually wrote a really stinging poem about him, and he was very offended by that, and so he kicked him out. That's one of the sort of rumors that circulated at that time. Yes, again, we don't know what kind of Jews. I want to make that clear. After battle with the Meccan tribes, he turns. So then he goes to battle with the Meccans. Why? Because he's raiding caravans along the Meccan trading route, and so the Meccans become upset by that. They get in a big fight. He loses to those Meccans. He says it's the Jews' fault. So the last final Jewish community that's in Yathrib, which becomes Medina, he murders all the adult males and puts the women and children to slavery, and indeed takes from them a Jewish wife. I think Muhammad had a few Jewish wives. I'm not sure. Muhammad also makes, at this point, several changes to Islam to distinguish it from Judaism. He changes the direction of prayer to Mecca instead of Yerushalayim. He changes prayer to 5 times a day instead of the measly 3 times a day that we do it. Because we fast a day, Muhammad's going to fast a whole month. He makes Friday the special day of prayer and not Saturday and not Sunday, because those have already been taken. Tuesday was on the table and Monday also, but everybody knows that God hates Mondays, so he switched it to Friday. He began to make hostile statements about Jews that are recorded in the Quran. This one, probably one of the most famous one. Thou will surely find the most hostile of men to the believers are the Jews and the idolaters. Now, to be fair, Jews and idolaters were pretty much the only people of power around him at the time, so that's what he's going to say. Unfortunately for us, we seem to always be in the way when new prophets show up and start preaching about how awesome their religion is going to be, and unfortunately, we are in the way as well here. After 8 years of fighting, he conquers Mecca, rids it of idol worshippers, and unites all the clans under Islam. In the next 2 years, he's united most of the Arab tribes in Arabia and forced subjugation on the Jewish and Christian tribes. In his own area of birth, the Hijaz, he kills and expels all the Jews. I'll take you back here. This area is called the Hijaz. He's going to make sure that it's completely Judean by the time he dies. He dies at 630 in the year 632. By the way, I'm using all standard secular dates here for this, mostly because I didn't have the time to go in and find out the what's called. By the way, interestingly enough, Muslims have also a lunar calendar. However, they do not try to match it up to the solar calendar as the Jews do. We have a very unique calendar. It's a lunar solar calendar, which is to say we measure months by the moon, but we also have to have Pesach in the spring and Sukkot in the fall. And so we add an extra month every couple of years to sort of shift everything to stay slightly around the solar calendar. The Muslims say no to that. They just go with the lunar calendar. So their year is slightly shorter, 355. And that means that their months sort of go around the solar months, which means sometimes they have Ramadan in the middle of summer. And for that, even I have pity on them. But sometimes they get it in the middle of winter. And for that, Yishkach for them. Now, he leaves behind the beginning of a religion and a very large army. Much of what will constitute the religion will be argued over, but one thing will be seen as an immediate necessity. Allah wants the Arabs to conquer. So, real quick note into the Quran and the Hadith with heavy amounts of Lahavdil Alf Abdullah sprinkled all over it. His official prophetic statements are subsequently collected in a book that we know today as the Quran. Quran just means recital, related to the Hebrew word kriya, right? This is considered the final word of Allah. It's important to understand that. According to Muhammad, Moshe, good prophet, had a lot of great ideas. Yashka, good prophet, had a lot of great ideas. But both of them got corrupted. My stuff, it is the main stuff. The things that I said are final and they are unchangeable. That is his baseline statement. So that's the Quran. Yes. The Torah itself, he says, has been changed and corrupted by the Jews, as well as the New Testament, right? The Quran and Hadith, sayings and practices attributed to him, but not strictly prophetic revelations, are called Hadith, right? So you have the Quran and you have the Hadith. The Quran is Lahavdil of Dallas Torah, and the Hadith is Lahavdil of Dallas the Gemara. It's all the stuff that they do on the side that sort of is filtered through everything that the Quran says. It's basically the way he lived his life, stories about how he did it. And by the way, they're going to have scholars just like we do who are obsessed, and unfortunately, some of them will be of Jewish origin, who are obsessed with sort of figuring out what are the right hadith, figuring out which ones disagree with each other, figuring out how to get them to correlate. When I say unfortunately, I mean by the time the Muslims start pushing through Mesopotamia, unfortunately, many Jews, obviously the majority won't, but unfortunately, a couple of yeshiva students are going to go off the derech and become Muslims. As a matter of fact, the premier historian of Islam was an ex-yeshiva student who became an Islamic scholar. That was, though, a little bit later, 11th century. The Quran, okay.
Was it written?
No, the Quran is written, again, Muhammad himself is illiterate. I'm not trying to be rude. He makes a point of it. He says to Jibril, hey, I can't write. So Jibril says to him, fine, get someone to write or recite, hence Quran. He recites them. So someone else writes all these down, and it's collected and arranged probably in the time of the second Rashidun Caliphate, which we'll talk about. So no, at this time, he does not have a thing. And of course, now modern historians are wondering precisely when this Quran book came around. Obviously, earlier historians are saying, well, it came around when it was said to come around, but modern historians are a little bit more skeptical. However, when you're exploring Christianity and Judaism, you get to have a little bit more leeway about what you say out loud and don't say out loud than when you're exploring Quran. So those modern historians are very careful. So what influences do we have on the Muslim holy book? Well, Islam is like Judaism in a very interesting way. As a matter of fact, Rambam will say that Islam is the closest thing we have to Judaism, and that if you go into a mosque, you're not even really doing anything wrong. Others will disagree, but basically, Islam, like Judaism, is a religion of practice. The emphasis is on practice, or as we say in Greek, praxis. It has the laws that govern daily action. The laws of Sharia are similar to halachos, again, lahavdil. So when someone says Sharia law, they're basically saying halachic law, right? Christianity, however, is a religion of belief, doxa. You have to believe that Yeshua saves. After that, the laws aren't so important. Now, they're important, but they're not taken from the Torah. They're taken from natural law and human law and different ideas and philosophical ideas. But Islam and Judaism are both religions of law, religions of divine. So that's important to understand. There are 5 pillars of Muslim pillars of faith, the profession of faith, or the shahada, 5 times daily prayers, or salat or salah, which is an Arabic word for prayer. I'm not convinced it didn't come from the Latin word salute or salutation. I didn't see anything confirming that, but that's my opinion. Almsgiving is zakat. I thought it was originally related to tzedakah, but it's not. Ramadan fast is saum, which is in fact related to the Jewish word for fast, which is tsum. And of course, the pilgrimage to Mecca is hajj, which is related to the Jewish word chag. Other laws with Jewish roots. Kosher becomes halal. Muslims may eat kosher meat, but Jews may not eat halal. This is because, by the way, why did kosher sort of get tied down a little bit? They were very upset that they couldn't eat camel. As a matter of fact, a sort of testing point for early Jewish converts was if they ate camel or not. And so you'll find these stories in the Hadith about this one convert who everyone tried to make eat camel, but he wouldn't, so he knew he wasn't really a convert. Shabbos has moved to Friday. Hand washing, of course, is already a custom amongst a lot of different cultures of that time. The idea of an eye for an eye comes from Judaism, but we've obviously toned that down a bit through the Gemara. And some Muslims are a little bit more exacting about that. Many other laws are borrowed from halacha. If you took the Torah, a bunch of Medrash, a little bit of Christianity, and you sort of tossed it in a blender, mixed it all together, you would get the Quran. Because of its communication with Christians and Jews, the Quran often references the Torah, and very interestingly, a bunch of Medrash. Abraham smashing his father's idols, for example, and throwing them into the fire. That's not in the Torah, but it comes down in the Quran. Stories of King Shlomo and the Queen of Sheba, not in the Torah, but they come down in the Quran. Hashem raising Har Sinai over the Jews, right? What's the expression? Har Kagigas, right? That comes down in the Quran, right? So a lot of, what's that? Yes. Again, trying to sort of prove that the Jews are a stiff-necked and unredeemable people. All of the stuff that Hashem says about the Jews being stiff-necked and unredeemable, Muhammad just recycles right into the Quran, unfortunately. The rise of Islam. So that's basically what we get from the Quran. Should we take a break at any time, or should I just keep burning? All right. We're going to do a very brief history of the first generations of Islam and the consequences of the Jews down the generations. So, if you look at this map, this little dark green part, that's the part that Muhammad conquers. The slightly less dark green part, that's Abu Bakr. The even more greenish part, I'm sorry, the majority of it, that's the Umayyads. And then this sort of lesser part ends up actually being, this part is under Ali, and then the majority of it comes under the Umayyads. So we'll discuss all of those people and what they mean to Judaism and to the world history as we move forward. So, yes. Yeah, we're getting to it right now. Muhammad dies, he leaves no sons. Lots of daughters, no sons. Who's going to be the next leader or caliph? Caliph just means successor. One group follows Ali. That's Muhammad's son-in-law, one of the first converts to Islam. Sweet guy, everybody loves him, but just not killy enough for most of the other Muslims. So, but they say, hey, look, Muhammad's holiness, and when I say that, I mean that sincerely. You'll see as we move forward that Ali just doesn't have what it takes to be a good Muslim leader. Claiming, however, they'll follow Ali, claiming that Muhammad's holiness transfers into his family, right? Others will say no. They'll follow Abu Bakr, and they'll say Muhammad was the end of prophecy. He said he was the end of prophecy. His family after him has nothing, right? The holiness does not transfer. They will follow Abu Bakr, and they will say the Sunnah is the main thing. They will have a fight. Yes, and that's why you'll have the party of Ali, or in Arabic, Shiat Ali will become the Shiites. The people who follow Abu Bakr will be the Sunnah followers, or the Sunnis. Shia will be the people who follow Ali. Sunnis will be the people who follow the Sunnah, or Abu Bakr. They, however, all agree to appoint Abu Bakr with a little bit of arm twisting, and that's one of Muhammad's fathers-in-law, and he will rule for 2 years. And he is an ultra chassid to his core. He does not have any patience for wealth accumulation, for any of this stuff. He is a true believer to his core. He spends all his time in the desert, never takes a shower, just war and davening and war and davening and war and davening. That's all he cares about. After he dies, they nominate Umar, another father-in-law of Muhammad. You can imagine he has a lot of fathers-in-law. Sure. Right. And Umar will be very interesting to the Jews, and we'll get to that in a minute. Now I want to talk for a minute about the 4 Rashidun, or rightly guided caliphates, caliphs, agreed by almost all Muslims to be good deputies of Muhammad. Abu Bakr, he expanded the territory and consolidated power. Umar, his generals greatly expanded the empire to Persia and, very importantly, to Israel. This is when Israel comes into the picture. He actually allowed Jews back into Jerusalem and began work at the Al-Aqsa Mosque at the same time. So a little bit of this, a little bit of that. Yeah. Prior to that was the Byzantines. And the Byzantines were terrible to the Jews. Remember, at this time, terrible to the Jews. Jews were basically not allowed to, again, to study Torah, to study Mishnah. This was under Justinian. He hated the Jews with a core. What was that? Eastern Byzantine Church, or the Byzantine Church, Orthodox, what is now the Orthodox Church, hated the Jews. Thought that they had betrayed him a couple of years back when they sided with the Persians, so on and so forth. Just really not a good guy at all. So when the Jews have to decide on someone to vote for, generally they vote for the slightly less bad guy. And in this case, Umar is the slightly less bad guy. Then we get Uthman. He finalizes the Quran and becomes and formalizes Islam further. But he also starts making some mistakes, appointing a lot of his cousins from his side of the family to all the main leadership positions, and people don't like that. So when he dies after being murdered, by the way, most of these guys are murdered. When Abu Bakr, I think, is killed by his slave, or Umar, one of them is killed by a slave. Uthman is actually murdered by a bunch of people who are super angry that he's appointing all of his cousins to everything. And finally, Ali comes into power. Nice guy, Ali, the final caliph, but he is way into something that Arabs generally aren't into, which is compromising. And so he's outmaneuvered by Uthman's cousin Muawiyah, and he's killed by zealots in his own party. I don't know if we'll get to that. There's some fun stories there as well. Basically, he finalizes the Quran. Remember, the Quran is a bunch of statements about Muhammad, but when did he say them? How did he say them? Generally, it's ordered from largest to smallest, but there's a lot of, but the question is, remember, I believe that this is a fact that even Muslims would agree on. I'm not positive. Remember, the Quran is ordered from largest passage to smallest passage, but there's a lot of discussion about precisely when and how Muhammad said what and where. And that becomes important to the Jews because when he's trying to get on the Jews' good side, says a lot of nice stuff about the Jews. When the Jews won't take him as a prophet, says a lot of bad stuff about the Jews. But that's the later stuff. So remember, when your final word is the final word of God, the last thing you say is more important than the first thing, right? So what is the last thing Muhammad said? And the last stuff he said, unfortunately, was about Jews. So you can find stuff in the Quran that's very nice toward Jews, but you can also find stuff in the Quran that's not so nice toward Jews. The question becomes, which one is more important in religious jurisprudence? Right. So now we get to talk about the Al-Aqsa Mosque as soon as I get up. Why is this little bit of Golden Dome so important to Muslims? Omar conquers Yerushalayim in 637. He is widely greeted as a liberator, not just by the Jews, but by the Christians there as well. Because remember, Christianity is undergoing its own stuff. There's people who believe, and what you believe in Christianity is the most important thing. There's people there who believe that God is that Jesus is the Son of God, or that Jesus is co-leader with God, under-leader with God. Is he a business partner, or is he just a main general manager? What is he? Is he the son of? Is his body a real body, or is it a fake body? Which is to say, a spiritual body. All of these things they're fighting over. So the people in Jerusalem at the time, they're very into the fact that Jesus had a human body and a spiritual neshama. So they're very upset at the Orthodox Christians in Constantinople who say that Jesus was some other kind of thing. So even the Christians actually accept him accept Umar into Jerusalem quite easily. Now, he also allows the Jews back in. At this time, the Jews were not allowed in to Jerusalem to pray. A small mosque at this time was possibly built on the Temple Mount. We are not positive, but we think maybe. It was definitely built by the Umayyads a little bit later. Over time, however, and this is important, the tradition forms that the mosque on the temple was the farthest mosque. What is the farthest mosque? Well, in Arabic, it's Masjid al-Aqsa, the farthest mosque. What is it? Well, at some point, Muhammad says, I traveled from the nearest mosque to the farthest mosque. Now, he probably meant from Medina to a suburb outside of Medina, but that's not how the Arabs will take it. They will take it to mean, what is the farthest mosque? Well, it has to mean that mosque in Yerushalayim. And they will develop an entire story around it, that Muhammad rode a special winged horse to Yerushalayim, and from there went up to Shemaim, and so on and so forth. This is going to become very important to the Jews. Again, Israel, Yerushalayim, never mentioned in the Torah, except Yerushalayim certainly never mentioned, in the Quran, except when, and Israel also never mentioned in the Quran, except when Muhammad says Israel belongs to the Jews. Right. Other than that, again, Muhammad had nothing to do with Jerusalem, probably never visited. However, this tradition kicks up. Now, modern scholars will say that at this time, the Umayyads are in a fight with the people in Mecca. And so they decide, in order to make their own place, their own mosque, their own sort of pilgrimage site, they're going to turn Yerushalayim into its own Arabic pilgrimage site. Why not? It's already a Jewish pilgrimage site. It's already a Christian pilgrimage site. Throw another religion in there. What could go wrong, right? So that is the current belief, that perhaps this was brought into play by the Umayyads in an attempt, while they're fighting with the leaders of Mecca and Medina, to have their own pilgrimage site. Whatever the reason, this tradition is the source of much current tension. 1 second, we got someone on the chat. I am not sure about Khosrow of Iran. I know Khosrow. I know the Iranians, the Persians did briefly capture Jerusalem in the 500s, and the Jews were super happy to have them there. But I am not sure about this. I'll have to look it up. Later. So, regardless of what it is, when we have a tradition, as you know, in Yiddishkeit, we are not super keen on hearing other versions of it, and ditto to the Muslims. They do not want to hear that the Umayyads probably set up Al-Aqsa as a secondary shrine because they were in a fight with the people in Mecca. So you guys can just get up and leave now, and we'll take back what's rightfully ours. That is not going to fly. So unfortunately, this little thing that happens with Umar just sort of showing up at the wall becomes the thing that it is today. And that's why Al-Aqsa becomes so important. However, so again, that's the downside for Umar. However, he does do something very important, and that is he formalizes Islamic relations with the quote-unquote people of the book. This is called famously the Pact of Umar. It's attributed to an agreement between Umar and the Jerusalem Patriarch, which is a Christian guy. This agreement solidifies the Islamic position on the people of the book. And what is it? Jews and Christians will be left unharassed. They will be allowed to abide by their own religion. Famously, Muhammad says in the Quran, there is no compulsion in religion. So Jews, Christians are allowed to do whatever they want. However, they do have to do two things. They have to pay the poll tax, a tax on the people for being non-religious, which is called the jizya, and they have to live as a protected second-class citizen called dhimmi. If they do these two things, then they can live in peace. Now, people will say that this is a sign of Islamic tolerance, and indeed, in certain times and places, it was. However, these could be some pretty embarrassing things. A lot of terrible stuff sort of revolved around it. Certain times and places, Jews were not allowed to. You were not allowed to look at Muslims. You were not allowed to ride horses. You were not allowed to carry weapons. You had to wear special clothing. So as much as we'd like to say that this was a kind of tolerance, it was and it wasn't to a certain extent. So after Uthman's death, Ali takes over, but he is outmaneuvered by Muawiyah. Interestingly enough, Muawiyah's soldiers will actually tie Qurans to their spears, and Ali's soldiers will not want to attack them. And that will force Ali and Muawiyah to reach a compromise. A lot of Ali's own soldiers will be very upset that Ali is reaching a compromise with Muawiyah. So Ali's own soldiers will go and revolt. They will end up killing him. Muawiyah will end up taking over. This is the beginning of the Sunni-Shia split. The Sunnis are those who follow Muawiyah. this is sort of the formalization of the Sunni Shia split. It starts a little bit earlier, but now it's formalized. If you follow the Sunnah and believe that Muhammad is the last holy person ever to have existed, then you are a Sunni Muslim. If you follow Ali and believe that the family of Muhammad has its own special sanctity, then you are a Shia Muslim. That is the very bare bones specific version of it, but it's much more complex. Yes. Shia means party of, faction of. Hashimi was a clan. Mr. Hashimi is descends from this line of Ali. And so his family in Afghanistan was treated with a lot of respect as a result of that. The Shias, at least, would have treated him with respect. The Sunnis would not have treated him with as much respect. Overall, to this day, Sunnis dominated and continue to dominate. They make up about 80% of Muslims. This, for example, is the Sunni-Shia split. And here's a little bit of modern history for you. Modern history intruding on modern times. The dark green here, that's Shia. You'll see that they're down here. Who's down here that we know of recently that's been bugging the Houthis? Guess what they are? They're Shia. The Iranians are Shia. And right here, if we sort of circle in the Hezbollah is also Shia. And so Iran is currently funding Hezbollah, funding Houthis, and funding Hamas. Now, interestingly enough, Hamas, not Shia, Sunnis, not fans of the Iranians, but when it comes to the Jews, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so once the Saudis stopped funding Hamas, which they did early on in the 90s, and the Saudis decided probably better to get along with the Jews at this time than the Iranians, because interestingly enough, the enemy of my enemy is my friend when it comes to, people, again, the internecine conflicts are delightful in this way. And so the Iranians are funding the Hezbollahs, they're funding the Houthis, and of course now they're funding the Sunnis. Although from what happened this year, they are funding two less people. Thank God. So again, not always that simple. And you'll see Turkey that is largely Sunni. Turkey nowadays is getting very uppity about Israel, again for a similar reason. If you can sort of be the one to be mad at Israel, you get some clout in the Islamic world. Okay, that's it. So let's talk about the spread of Islam. Why did Islam spread so fast? Well, Abu Bakr invokes the concept of jihad, or striving. This encourages the spread of Islam. Bedouins have superior military skills. Everyone else is exhausted. The Persians and the Byzantines were weakened by internal and external strife and exhausted. The Bedouins happen to have, not the Bedouins, I should say the Arabs, because they are different. The Arabs happen to have some pretty amazing generals. One guy in particular, the Sword of Ali, he ends up being almost like Alexander in his ability to command an army. He does a lot of conquering. Conquered peoples could keep their religions and achieve high position at the same time. This is not a bad deal, right? If you're a Christian, but the wrong kind of Christian, you're perfectly happy to let the Muslims in. Ditto the Jews. If you're a Jew, then you're definitely the wrong kind of person in Christianity. So you're also perfectly happy to let the Muslims in. Persecuted minorities likely welcome Islamic invaders, including Coptic and Nestorian Christians, and Jews like Bustanai. Bustanai famously is the sort of crossover exilarch, the crossover Reish Galusa. He serves the Persians very loyally, and then he serves the Omar very loyally, or Ali. I forget. I don't remember the story quite well, but that's when that whole story happens, right? What happens? I believe it's Omar. Omar comes in, he takes a Persian princess, he gives the Persian princess to Bustanai. Now Bustanai has kids with that Persian princess. Are they Jewish? It's going to become a big deal. It's going to create the Karaites. That's his whole other history, and maybe next year we'll talk about that. So what happens to the Umayyads? Well, Muawiyah's dynasty, the Umayyads conquer the most stuff. All the way from France, and yes, they do in fact get deep into France before getting kicked back, all the way to India. Old trade networks. Remember, these are places that have not talked to each other, that have been fighting constantly. Old trade networks are suddenly revived and start to thrive. Arabic becomes a shared language across massive amounts of space. Jews now live under a generally benign tolerance and neglect that only occasionally foments into active hatred, and they can travel and trade across a vast area. They settle in communities in Cairo, Baghdad, Kairouan, and Cordoba. As they spread and grow, communities begin to solidify into a structured system of community that we now come to know as the Kehillah. This is Jewish life under Islam, which is to say, Jewish communal organization and the rise of the Gainim. The Kehillah was the semi-official communal body of Jews. They existed within the larger government as a legal body responsible for their own governments and taxation. Leaders created and enforced rules, collected taxes, and represented the community to the government. They maintained charity foundations for helping the poor and redeeming captives, burial societies, and interest-free loan offices. They hired communal teachers, built and repaired shuls, and paid the shul employees. This system, by the way, that has started under Islam will remain the same until the rise of nation states and civil services in the 1800s. It still continues in many ways today. It's very, very different today, but to some extent or another, we still follow the Kehillah rules. There's also the Beis Din. In addition to the Kehillah, now the Kehillah is usually run, let's be honest, by the rich people, but the rich people have a check against them, and that is the Beis Din, the learned people. They are, in many cases, the Beis Din is legally autonomous and coercive, which means they could set laws and enforce them. They could go to the Islamic Caliph and say, hey, could you give us a couple of your soldiers so we can enforce this law against this other Jew? And the Caliph would say, sure, go ahead, take some of my soldiers and enforce the law. They basically had their own system of enforcement and everything else. Jews follow Jewish rules, Christians follow Christian rules, and Muslims follow Muslim rules. Now, if a Jew and a Muslim came together, the Muslim rules win. But interestingly enough, even in Islam, the sign of a good Muslim jurisprudence scholar, very famously, and the expression that arose was, he even ruled for a Jew against a Muslim. That was the sign of a good one, right? The appointees of the Beis Din were the exilarch and the Gainim of Sur and Pupadis. So the exilarch is the Reish Galusa. I don't know how much you know about him. We don't have a lot of time to get into him, but basically he's the last sign of the house of David. And the Gainim of Sur and Pupadisa are basically the main heads of the yeshiva. They were given authority to receive taxes to finance it. These Batei Dinim were preferable to government courts as they ruled in line with halacha. They avoided generally, in most cases, outright bribery, and they did not torture for evidence or hand out the death penalty. This is important in Yiddishkeit as opposed to other places. Torturing for evidence is not allowed. Evidence must come from two other people. You cannot self-incriminate in Yiddishkeit. And so the idea of torturing a person to self-incriminate never gains ground in Yiddishkeit, right? That's it. It's that simple. I am not allowed to say I did it. Two other people have to come and tell me that they did it. And so as much as you torture me and as much as I say I did it, it doesn't count in Yiddishkeit. It will count in Islam and it will count in Christianity. And so torture will become a very popular method of getting people to say they did it in Christianity and in Islam. But thank God, our God in this particular case, he did not allow that in Yiddishkeit. Also, they could not hand out the death penalty. Not always true, by the way. Very occasionally, they were in fact capable of handing out the death penalty. And in many Islamic countries, we're also capable of handing out a certain amount of bodily mutilation. There's shals teshuvas from the Rashba and stuff. You're allowed to cut out the tongue of certain people and so on and so forth. In particular, in one case and one case only, and that is when someone's about to tell on you to the government, right? To this day, we consider someone who's about to tell on you to the government as a, what's the term for it? As a meiser, right? And so they are basically like someone who's going to try and kill you, and so you are allowed to kill them first. Now, rarely did they kill them, but every now and again, the Rashba decided that you had to cut out a tongue or two. The Ga'anim are the interpreters of the Talmud. Now, this, by the way, this time period is the time period of the Ga'anim. Who are the Ga'anim? Remember, we're talking about Tanaim, Amoraim, and Ga'anim. The Ga'anim, how much time do we have, by the way? Because I could honestly go on forever. 15 minutes? All right. The Ga'anim are very important. The Jews look to the Torah for laws. The Talmud Bavli spreads across the known world. But then, as today, it's not a very clear text, so the Ga'anim come and interpret it. It took a lot to be a Ga'anim. The Ga'anim in Bavel, the Reish Galusa reemerges. The heads of the yeshiva emerge on equal footing. Around this time, they begin using the title that we know as Gaon. Where does that title come from? Rosh Yeshivas Gaon Yaakov. It's from Tehillim. Oh, is that also as well? Right, because the Meiri says in order to be a Gaon, you basically had to know you had to know everything by heart. But Gaon Yaakov comes from a Tehillim, that's Gaon Yaakov, so the splendor of Yaakov. It's related actually to the Hebrew word for pride, Gaon, splendor, pride, gaiva, so on and so forth. The custom of Yarchei Kala is reestablished at this time. If you don't know about Yarchei Kala, look it up. It's delightful. Everyone will get together, learn the same Masechta. It says when the Jews finished Yarchei Kala and they got up and they slapped out their coats to leave, the dust storm would hit Israel a couple days later. What are the Goyim most famous for? They're most famous for beginning Shalos and Shuvas literature, which is to say, beginning the concept of writing and asking questions. This is where they make their money. This is where they make their debut on the world stage. A guy in Spain wants to know precisely how to daven. Amram Gaon's going to send him a siddur. That's the first siddur we have. A guy in Chayruan wants to know, he's fighting the Karaites, he wants to know what's the Messiah. So Shiur Gaon's going to write his famous book, famous letter, a Garris of Shiur Gaon, that explains the Messiah. This is the time when the Gaonim really rise. After the Umayyads, the Abbasids take over. The second caliph, basically they murder every Umayyad they could find except one, which is good for the Umayyads and good for the Jews, because he's going to go to Spain and he's going to start the convivencia. That's going to mean good times for the Jews in Spain. The second caliph, Al-Mansur, is going to move to Baghdad. This is when Baghdad becomes a thing. He's going to found the city of Baghdad. It's going to mark the golden age of Islam in terms of science, technology, philosophy, et cetera, and the Jews are going to become a big part of that. Why? Well, because land taxes on dhimmis caused increased migration of Jews to the cities. Basically, if you were dhimmi, you had to pay ridiculous amounts of land taxes. So might as well get up and go to New York City like all the other Jews, start a little shop out on the corner selling pickles, and before you know it, you run a whole pickle empire, right? The Goyim do this. The Goyim do the same thing. They're out in Surah and Pumbedisa. Why? Go to Baghdad. So now you have Pumbedisa and Surah in Baghdad. That's not unusual. For example, Lubavitch is not in Lubavitch anymore. It's in New York. Ditto Tel Yeshiva. Ditto pretty much everything. This is a consequence of the inevitable shift to city life of the Jews. And by the way, this is when it will start. At this time and place, Jews will stop becoming farmers and start becoming city dwellers. It's just easier. It's just easier if you live in these countries to have the kahila, to have everything else, and considering all the onerous taxes that are placed on you, Jews are going to start living in cities. What's that?
80% of Jewish people, 80%.
Yeah, 80%. At this time, by the way, in the 750s, the Ashkenazim don't exist yet. In the 900s, they start, supposedly Charlemagne's going to invite them in. They're going to start these little tiny communities along the Rhine. The Ashkenazim are wandering around now in the muck and mire of Upper France, barely starting any yeshivas. You're going to have a couple of guys now. At this same time, the Goyim are flourishing. Spain's going to start to flourish. It's going to be a great time for Sfarad. The yeshivas and their rabbis at this time also start to become more aware of outward culture. Sciences and philosophies is going to be a big part of Sephardi culture. And next, the Abbasids start to fall apart. Too much time for Arabs spent on science and philosophy means not enough time spent on conquering the world. And so pretty soon, other different cultures start to break in. And by the 1000s and 1100s, the entire empire has sort of broken up into little mini statelets and empires. The Fatimids, the Buyids, the Harmatans, the Hamadians, the Hyrcanians, the Samanids, the Ghassanids, and way up here in Spain, the Umayyads, who's going to be very important. This is going to be reflected in Judaism. Once Baghdad stops becoming the center of the center of Islamic law, now also it stops becoming the center of Tyre. We have the traditional story of the four captives, right? The Ravid story of the four captives. There's a bunch of people on a boat. They're captured by pirates, and they are sold across the cities of the Mediterranean, where they each start their own yeshivas, right? They're on a mission. Okay, these rabbis were redeemed. Shmaya ben Elchanan in Alexandria, Hushiel in Tunisia, Moshe ben Chanai and his son Chanai famously in Cordoba, and the fourth remains unknown. By the way, this is an interesting story because we have the four captives. No one ever talks about the fourth one. I always wonder what happened to him. This, by the way, is also how you know it was probably real, right? It's not perfect. If it's not perfect, it's probably real. And indeed, many people do actually say that the story of the four captives is real. A lot of history is about just poking holes in all the delightful legends. A lot of people still agree that this one is probably real. The rabbis founded yeshivas, especially in Spain, that would replace Babel as the centers of dynamic learning and an innovative approach to halacha. It marks the beginning of the era we call the Rishonim. Spanish Jewry in Sfarad, the Spanish Jews under the tolerant Islamic rule will initiate a golden age of rabbinic learning. Sfarad, as Spain became known, or Sfard, produced innumerable Rishonim whose rulings set the tones for modern Jewish law and Torah commentary, the Rif, the Rambam, Ibn Ezra, hundreds of other ones. Those are just the most ones I pulled right off the top of my head. Even as Sfarad comes under Christian control, the culture of learning continues with the Ramban, the Ravid, and the Rosh. All lived in Spain. Interestingly, all lived under Christian rule in Spain. Still, at the time, because Spain was basically Christians and Muslims fighting each other, the Jews actually had a lot of leeway under those Christians. The Rosh's son, would go on to write the Torah, the foundational text for Jewish law. The Torah is the first one that takes halacha and puts them into the Arbiturim. Before that, you had the Rif. He basically just sort of made a Reader's Digest of the Gemara. Then you had the Mishnah Torah, which everyone got upset about for some reason. And finally, you had the Torah, who basically took the vast compendium of halacha and put it into a manageable set of 4 basic rules and regulations. By the way, this is another instance of what Sfard likes to do. While the Ashkenazim are in the Rhineland, obsessing over what Gemara connects to what Gemara, making massive, beautiful compilations of Taisvas, they want to know each individual little thing. The people in Sfarad, they're under Islamic rule, they're under Islamic dominance. They are very interested in making everything come together and coalesce into one big, beautiful thing. And so they're going to actually end up doing most of the compilation that comes. The early Rishonim of Sfarad are going to do most of the compilation of halacha, while the rabbis in Ashkenaz are not going to worry about that for a long time. This is all before the Crusades. A few centuries later, after the expulsion of Spain, which we don't unfortunately have time to talk about, a fellow Sephardi living in Tzfas, Rabbi Cairo, will write the Shulchan Aruch, composed primarily of rulings from the Rif, the Rambam, and the Rosh. Right, the Rosh again is the only one of those who's not a Sfard, technically an Ashkenaz guy, but ends up doing most of his rulings in Sfarad after leaving Ashkenaz, running away from the French king. However, in Christian Poland at this time, another young man will rear his head. Rav Moshe Isserlis will add his notes to provide minhagim and ruling unique to European Judaism, formalizing what we now know today as Ashkenazi minhag, and what particularists will call Eastern Ashkenazi minhag, because there's also Western Ashkenazi minhag. The ascendancy of Ashkenaz. This is it. This marks the end of the Rishonim and the beginning of the Acharayim, widely seen by Ashkenazim as the ascendancy of Ashkenaz. Sephardim might disagree. But I will tell you that if you open up a modern Shulchan Aruch, you're going to get the Mechaber, then you're going to get the Ramah. So the Mechaber is the one Sephardi guy on the page, unfortunately, and oftentimes has the least amount. Then you get the Ramah's Hagaz, or his notes. Then you're going to get the word salad on the side. These are almost all going to be Ashkenaz, right? In summation, now we're going to today. Judaism under Islam, from the 600 to the 1700s. We'll wrap it up, guys. I promise we'll be out here before 10. Without a doubt, up until modern times, Jews in Islamic lands lived much better lives than Jews in Christian lives. I want to say, much better does not mean awesome, right? They were seen as low and servile. They were required to wear special colored clothes or patches. They were made to undergo embarrassing rituals of giving the jizya tax. In some instances, in order to give the jizya tax, they would have to show up, pull down their pants to show their breasts, and then give the jizya tax, and other kinds of stuff like that. They couldn't ride horses or carry weapons. They weren't allowed to look Muslims in the eye. They weren't allowed to pass a Muslim on the street without lowering their head. So many different little rules and regulations, again, depending on time and place. Sometimes they had it a lot easier, and sometimes they didn't. But
There's a shliach, that special part we've done this past.
yeah, right. In certain times and places, it was brutal. And Avadia Bar-Nur, actually, very interestingly, was one of those times. When he shows up in Israel, Israel's been decimated. The Jews have been fighting each other, and the Muslims have been upset at the Jews. Avadia Bar-Nur himself will end up sort of revitalizing Judaism in Israel at that time. Prior to him, unfortunately, a lot of terrible stuff happened. I'm not doing this, by the way, someone else. Yes, if you were under, for example, in the 60s, right?
In Turkey, what's today Turkey, and some of the other areas, it was like 2 years for good.
But even in Turkey, if you were a Romanite Jew, then you had to follow Turkish law. But if you were a Sephardi Jew, then you sort of had the Genoese, you sort of had your own, you were allowed to follow your own religious custom. If you were under the Shiites, you had a worse time of it than if you were under the Sunnis. But regardless of all this, they were tolerated under the Islamic legal system of dhimmi, which is to say, at least they had a legal system to recourse to. They did not have to rely on unreliable noble patronage, as the Jews of Europe had to do. They did not have to undergo daily sermons or weekly sermons, as the Jews in Europe had to do. They were not preached against daily by itinerant preachers or seen as children of the devil. This is a sign of the priest. It says, read it. It says, Shema Meforish. And this is Jews suckling at the teat of a pig, right? The sort of terrible hatred that Christianity developed for the Jews simply did not develop in Islam. They were treated as lowly nothing. Jews weren't worthy of your hate if you were Islamic. You were a powerful, empire-spanning person. You didn't even want to see a Jew in your time. You didn't hate him. He wasn't the child of the devil. Ideally, you would have nothing to do with him. That was it. That's the main difference. Anti-Jewish riots did happen in Islam. It is not possible to say that it didn't. However, they happen with a lot less frequency and less vitriol than in Europe. However, with the rise of the age of modernity and the new ideas that began to shape the political world of Europe from the 16th century onward, Jews and Christian Europe began to slowly, and then obviously big reversals, come under better circumstances. They were given legal rights under increasingly secular government. In Poland, they found a really nice niche for themselves at times, basically mediating between Polish governors, Polish landlords who wanted to live in Warsaw and never have to think about their properties, and Ukrainian peasants who wanted to kill their Polish landlords and sometimes settled on the Jews. But that they did have a nice niche for a long period of time in Poland. Even then, however, Jews suffered from riots, governmental persecutions, and of course, the ultimate national racial backlash of the Holocaust. In the meantime, Jews under the Ottoman Empire based in modern-day Turkey lived as they always had, despised, nevertheless under a tolerant legal framework. Still, the Islamic world was lagging behind. European advances quickly overtook Islamic supremacy in sciences and engineering, and by the First World War, the Ottoman Empire had become known as the sick man of Europe. Its power was slowly being eaten away by European nations. Probably the beginning of this was when Napoleon invaded Egypt. When Napoleon showed up in Egypt, it really was the beginning of the end for the Muslims. From prior to that point, they thought they were in charge. Again, Europe was a shtickle little bunch of warring city-states out on the edges of the peripheries of the world. Islam was Islam. I mean, they spanned from India to Africa. The dissolution of the Ottoman Empire shattered these notions of Islamic dominance. Shattered them. The caliphate was no more. Secular nation states were rising up everywhere. Muslim leaders and thinkers were forced to deal for the first time with the fact that they were now the spoils and not the founders of empire. And this really, really did shatter the Islamic psyche. Many embraced conspiracy theories and anti-Semitic tropes absorbed from Egypt, right? The creation of Israel seemed to prove all of those theories, and the Arab world erupted in anti-Jewish riots and expulsions. Within a few years, Jewish communities as old as the Second Temple had emptied and been eliminated. Within a generation, the nexus of Jew hatred switched poles from Christianity to Islam, and today we continue to deal with this complex legacy. Thank you, everyone, for coming. What's that? Yeah, you see it at a
where do we convert? Are you converting us?
No, I personally, it's not my style. Actually, again,
You're going to?
We're technically